Movies are more than just a classic, entertaining pastime. They're complex works of art that bring brilliant minds and talented actors together to convey compelling stories. Some movies are meant to make you laugh and others to make you cry, but some serve the purpose of making you drop your jaw in shock and confusion. These 5 films have been described as weird or disturbing, and have even been compared to fever dreams due to their magical yet unsettling flow. Number 5. No weird movie list would be complete without the mention of the 1980 Italian supernatural horror film Inferno. A simple online explanation of the plot states that the movie follows a young man's investigation into the disappearance of his sister, who'd been living in a New York City apartment building that also served as a home for a powerful yet centuries-old witch. As eerie as that may sound, it's nothing in comparison to how out of pocket this colorful film actually becomes. Inferno is technically a sequel to the film Suspiria, and both of them are part of a trilogy in the same universe. However, of the 3 films, Inferno seems to have gotten the most attention over the years. A deeper look into the plot shares that a young woman named Rose Elliott moves into an apartment in New York where she finds ancient texts discussing 3 supernatural powerful beings known as the Three Mothers. She's convinced that she's living in the home of the Mother of Sighs and contacts her brother for help. Shortly after this, she vanishes, and he must report to the scene to embark on a mysterious journey to find his sister. Along the way, he faces many obstacles from the normal realm of the world and from the supernatural powers that dwell in the shadows. Much of the movie is filmed on sets that resemble theater stages, which grips the audience in a different way than the average filming. It puts the viewer in a seat and brings them closer to the scene, making the weird and terrifying moments even more effective. Although the plot and story can be easily understood, there are certain aspects that make absolutely no sense, but that's actually on purpose. The film practices a method of confusing the audience as yet another artistic tactic to bring them in. The more difficult to understand portions of the film are also confusing and disorienting to the characters involved, and overall lend a fever dream style to Inferno. It's considered a classic weird horror flick, and it's been given praise for decades as new cinephiles burst onto the scene. It's also considered one of the greatest works from this director, holding its own as a standalone film, trilogy aside. It's about 2 hours long and has a 64% Rotten Tomatoes score, as well as an 84% Google audience rating. Number 4. The 2015 film Highrise, directed by Ben Wheatley, starring Tom Hiddleston, Jeremy Irons, and Sienna Miller, might not be everyone's cup of tea. However, it perfectly fits the bill for this list due to its twisted nature and disturbing series of events. This adaptation of J.G. Ballard's 1975 novel follows a character named Dr. Robert Lang, played by Tom Hiddleston. In a distant reality that shares details both with utopian and dystopian timelines, Dr. Lang moves into a high-rise apartment building that has its own community within its walls. Residents rarely have to leave their tight-knit community thanks to the convenience of grocery stores and bars located in the block. The film accurately portrays classism by placing residents based on their income. The lowest level houses struggling families and broke students, while the penthouse and roof level gives the building's owner a mansion-like apartment and garden. It's clear that the goal of many residents is to literally grow up the ladder and eventually make their way to the prestigious top floors, where residents are treated like royalty. As Dr. Lang struggles to fit into the community, caught midway between the rich and the poor, he starts to struggle with his own identity and behavior. The trouble isn't exclusive for Dr. Lang though. Everyone in the building faces their own issues, and when maintenance issues start to inconvenience the lives of residents, things eventually begin to fall apart. Power outages, a shortage of resources, and all-out riots plague the building and eventually turns the population against one another. From fighting and property damage to theft and pure insanity, the community collectively loses its mind. The audience witnesses this downward spiral, mostly through the eyes of newcomer Dr. Lang. The main purpose of the film isn't relative to any specific character, or even a solid ending. Instead, the story is used as a framework to explore human nature, society, and politics. Even the character that could most easily be labeled as the protagonist is more of an anti-hero, because we aren't meant to focus on the good or bad side in this wild tale, because humans commonly aren't one or the other. Instead, they fall into a gray area like many of these characters do. Issues with the plot might deter some viewers from sitting through the entire film, but if you focus on the performances and the underlying issues being conveyed, this chaotic film will drop your jaw and leave you feeling disappointed with certain conditions in the world today. Highrise is about 2 hours long and has a 60% score on Rotten Tomatoes. Number 3. This film has been described as both a comedy and a horror, so depending on the viewer, its impact can vary greatly. It is, however, without a doubt, a very strange film with a plot that may make your skin crawl. From the creative mind of Kevin Smith, this 2014 film, Tusk, follows a podcast star, Wallace Brighton, portrayed by Justin Long, in a completely grotesque situation that alters his life dramatically. Wallace and his co-star, Teddy Kraft, run a podcast named Not See Party, where they review viral videos. Wallace travels to Canada to interview an internet celebrity featured in one of the show's videos. Upon his arrival, he finds that the star is no longer living, and to avoid his trip being an entire waste, he makes arrangements to stay with an older gentleman named Howard that left a brochure at a local bar offering a room for rent and an evening of very interesting stories. Wallace finds the man's home, which turns out to be an old manor, and is welcomed in with open arms. The home is filled with obscure artifacts that all apparently come with wild stories that Wallace is eager to document for his podcast. Over a cup of tea, Howard shares a compelling story of the time a walrus saved his life. As their conversation continues, Wallace realizes that his tea has been spiked, and he inevitably passes out. The next day, Wallace wakes up in the middle of an empty room, strapped tightly to a wheelchair. Howard explains to Wallace that he's going to transform him into a walrus. He lays out his detailed and horrifying plans to alter Wallace's body. The rest of the film follows the sickening transformation, as well as the side plot of Wallace's girlfriend and co-star jumping through hoops to find her companion. But a short spoiler alert, this film doesn't have a happy ending, and it only seems to get worse and worse as the story progresses. Tusk didn't do very well at the box office or amongst critics, but it's become somewhat of a cult classic. Number 2. Another mind-boggling creation by David Lynch, Mulholland Drive, is a 2001 neo-noir mystery film that brings the viewer into a disorienting plot which strongly resembles a fever dream of sorts. A woman wakes up to find herself as a survivor of a car accident along Mulholland Drive. Suffering from amnesia, she has no idea who she is or where she's from. While walking aimlessly, she ends up in Los Angeles, which is portrayed in this film starkly different from what the city is really like. It's a calm and nearly deserted town with no traffic and a minimal nightlife. After coming across a movie poster, the unidentified woman assumes the name Rita for the time being. After she finds an open apartment unit, she makes herself at home and is later discovered by a thriving actress, Betty Elms, whose aunt normally occupied the apartment. As you would expect, this film focuses on identity and portrays a compelling story through the struggles of Rita and Betty as they try to unveil the truth. Mulholland Drive follows the format of many Lynch films with seemingly irrelevant side plots, an often puzzling narrative, and symbolic scenes left with open ends for the viewers to freely interpret their own meaning. Without spoiling too much, the overall plot of the movie, which is better understood after watching it, tells the tale of a bitter actress engaged in a love triangle that seeks revenge on her lover while ultimately spiraling out of control mentally and losing sight of her own identity and the role that she plays in the events that unravel. From the complex plot, impressive symbolism, and beautiful visuals, Mulholland Drive is considered one of David Lynch's greatest works and is even listed at number 8 in the 2012 Sight and Sound Critics poll for best films ever made. Number 1. This entry takes the number 1 spot because it was released recently in 2019 and has been referred to as one of the best unorthodox films to be released in the last few years. The Lighthouse, directed by Robert Eggers, is described as a Canadian-American psychological horror film. It stars Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe as lighthouse keepers. Robert stuck to a classic style, using a film ratio popular in the 1920s and 30s, which supports the tense scenes between the characters. The story is set in the late 19th century on a remote island. A young man named Ephraim Winslow, played by Robert Pattinson, is sent to the isolated island just off the coast of New England, where he works for an elderly man named Thomas Wake. Immediately, Wake begins behaving strangely and puts strain on the men's relationship by ordering that Winslow take the heavier work and do everything in perfect detail. One night, the fateful storm hits and leaves the men stranded alone together. As time goes on, they lose more and more of their sanity. They share wild, intense tales with one another, get into more than a few arguments, and even discover a mythical creature that had washed ashore. This film takes the viewer down a dark hole of paranoia, altered realities, distrust, and anger. Many reviews of this film make a point to mention that despite many aspects being confusing, the performances given by these talented actors makes the otherwise spineless story compelling and intoxicating to say the least. Yet again, this movie is similar to a crazy fever dream in many ways, and it leaves the audience wondering who was right, who was wrong, and what was real, and even what was fake. However, that's clearly the entire point of the film. It's received great praise in the film industry and continues to attract positive reviews from experts and average viewers alike. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to click that like button. And if you loved it, maybe consider subscribing and clicking the notification bell. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you in the next video.